The letter sat unfinished on the workbench at 2 in the morning, the way it always did on the 13th of January. Grayson Mercer had started it 6 times. 6 sheets of paper, each one carrying the same opening line, before his hand stopped moving and the words dried up somewhere between his chest and the pen. He'd torn the first 5 into pieces small enough that they couldn't be read even if someone found them. The 6th he'd left intact, sitting under the yellow light of the compound's main garage, next to a coffee cup gone cold and a photograph he'd stopped being able to look at directly. Clara, 13 years old today. He knew the letter would come back unopened. It always did. Her mother intercepted everything: the birthday cards, the Christmas packages, the emails that bounced back with automated responses. He was fairly certain no machine had written. 4 years, 3 months, and 18 days since the last time Clara had looked at him without fear in her eyes. He'd memorized that number the way soldiers memorize things that kept them functional. Not because the memorizing helped, just because forgetting felt like the worst betrayal. Outside, the Montana desert did what it always did in January. It tried to kill everything. Wind moved across the 23 acres of scrub land that made up the compound with the kind of patience that didn't care whether you were ready for it. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees before midnight and kept going. The RVs and converted storage containers that housed the Brotherhood were buttoned up tight heat, running the settlement looking from a distance like a small town that had given up on being pretty but hadn't yet given up on being alive. Graves pressed his right hand flat against the workbench and waited for the trembling to stop. It didn't. It never fully stopped anymore. The IED had done something to the nerve pathways that 3 separate military doctors had described in 3 different ways. But the practical reality was simple. His right hand shook. It shook when he was tired, and it shook when he was stressed, and it shook when he sat too still, which meant it shook almost constantly now that the war was 17 years behind him, and he'd run out of forward motion to disguise it. He'd learned to work around it, learned to pour coffee with his left hand, to write with his left hand, to do most things with his left hand, while his right just trembled quietly at his side, like a reminder he hadn't asked for and couldn't return. He picked up the pen left-handed and looked at the 6th sheet of paper. Dear Clara, today you're 13 and I don't know what that looks like for you. He put the pen down. There was a version of this letter that said everything he needed to say. That told her he understood why she was scared of him. That acknowledged the restraining order had existed for a reason, even if that reason felt like ancient history from where he stood now. That explained how a man could come home from a war fundamentally rewired and spend years believing the rewiring was permanent before discovering that it wasn't quite. If he worked hard enough and stayed honest enough and surrounded himself with people who'd survived the same rewiring and could call him out when he started lying to himself. He'd written versions of that letter. They'd come back too. The phone on the workbench lit up at 2:14. Not a call. A text from a number he recognized but hadn't heard from in almost 2 years. Naomi Voss, St. Mercy, please call me, now. He stared at the screen for a moment. Naomi Voss was an ER nurse at St. Mercy Hospital in Rusk Creek, the town 12 miles north of the compound. He knew her the way you knew people in a small Montana town where everyone's history was visible if you looked sideways at it long enough. She'd stitched up 2 of his brothers after a bar fight 3 years back. She'd treated Prophet's hand when a carburetor had expressed its opinion about being rebuilt. She was competent and direct with a tiredness in her eyes that had been there long enough to stop looking temporary. She'd never texted him at 2 in the morning before. He called. She answered on the first ring. He could hear the hospital in the background, that pressurized quiet, that wasn't actually quiet at all, just all the noise compressed and controlled into something manageable. There's a little girl, Naomi said. No preamble. 8 years old. She walked into the ER 40 minutes ago. No shoes, January. The coat she was wearing hid the burns. Graves said nothing. Cigarette burns, Naomi continued. Dozens of them. Some old enough to have scarred over. Some fresh enough to still be weeping. She didn't cry when I examined her. Not once. She just stared at the ceiling and let me document it. The garage felt colder suddenly. Stepfather's name is Dale Pruitt. He was arrested at 9:15 tonight. He posted bail at 11:30. His brother is Deputy Colt Pruitt. Colt drove him home personally. I watched it on the security monitors. Her voice didn't waver, but he could hear what was underneath it. CPS isn't sending anyone until Monday morning. It's Friday night. The system has already decided this one doesn't count. What's her name? Graves said. Lily Cross. Is she scared? A pause. She's past scared. She's in the place children go when being scared has stopped being useful. Graves looked at the unfinished letter on the workbench, looked at the photograph he couldn't look at directly. Which diner, he said. The Black Lantern on Route 9 hadn't been updated since before Graves had shipped out the first time. It smelled like burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke, and the booths had vinyl so worn it had absorbed decades of difficult conversations and never let them go. The kind of place that existed in every small town serving people who needed somewhere to sit that wasn't home. And Naomi was in the corner booth farthest from the windows. Her scrubs had blood on them that wasn't Lily's, some other emergency from earlier in the night that she hadn't had time to change out of. She had both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, and she was watching the hospital across the street through the snow-hammered glass like she could keep it safe by not blinking. She looked up when Graves came in. He watched her register him the way people always registered him in unfamiliar context, the size of him first, the scarring second, a stillness in the way he moved that people correctly read, as someone who had learned hesitation got people killed. He'd stopped apologizing for the impression he made. It was accurate. He sat down across from her without asking. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I haven't." She pushed a menu toward him that he didn't touch. "How much do you want me to explain before you tell me whether you can help?" "Tell me about the girl." She told him. All of it. The way Lily had walked in wearing a coat 2 sizes too large in the deliberate way of a child who'd learned that concealment was survival. The examination, the documentation, the camera that felt heavier than it should have. The specific geography of the burns, not random, not accidental, mapped across ribs and shoulders, in patterns that told a story about repeated methodical cruelty administered by someone with patience and a cigarette and absolute certainty that no one was watching. "The fresh ones are from this week," Naomi said. "The oldest ones I can see are at least 2 years old, maybe 3. She paused. Her mother died 14 months ago. Car accident. Single vehicle, straight road, no skid marks in the report. Something shifted in Graves's chest, slow and cold. "Lily's been with Dale Pruitt since then," Naomi continued. "He was already in the picture before the mother had been with him for 3 years. But after Ellen Cross died, he got formal custody. No contest, no investigation. Colt Pruitt filed the paperwork." "His brother," Graves said. "His brother." She looked at him steadily. "The same brother who drove him home tonight after the arrest. The same brother who I guarantee is already working on making the medical documentation disappear before Monday." Graves put both hands flat on the table. His right trembled against the formica. He didn't press it down. "Dale Pruitt is going to come back for her," Naomi said. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. He's going to walk into that hospital with Colt beside him and they're going to take her, and CPS is going to spend until Monday writing reports about it. And by Tuesday, the whole thing will have been swallowed by the machinery, and Lily Cross will be back in a house where someone uses her as an ashtray." Across the street, St. Mercy glowed through the storm, a ship trying not to sink. "What do you want me to do?" Graves said. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "I want you to make sure that doesn't happen." "That's not a specific request." "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm asking anyway." Graves sat with that for a moment. Outside, the snow came down with the indifference of weather that didn't care about deadlines or courthouse schedules or the gap between what the law said and what justice looked like. He thought about Clara, about the birthday letter still unfinished on the workbench. about the photograph he couldn't look at directly. Then he pulled out his phone. The text he sent was 11 words. He had a contact list that had taken 7 years to build 91 names, men he trusted with things that mattered more than money or reputation. Men who had been broken by wars or by homecomings or by the particular violence of becoming someone your own family was afraid of, and who had found their way to the compound outside Russ Creek because there was nowhere else left to go. He sent the message, put the phone away, stood up and left a 20 on the table for coffee he hadn't ordered. "How long before Pruitt comes for her?" he said. Naomi's throat tightened visibly. "Hours, maybe less." Graves pulled on his jacket. "It's handled," he said. Then he walked out into the snow. The sound reached St. Mercy Hospital 40 minutes later. It came from the direction of the mountain's first low and rolling, the kind of sound that your body registered before your brain caught up with it. Thunder had randomness in it, a quality of accident and weather. This was different, organized, rhythmic building in layers, the way military formations built individual units converging into something larger than the sum of its parts. Naomi stood at the window of the third-floor room where Lily slept and watched them arrive. They came in ones and twos and clusters of 4 and 5, rolling through the freezing rain with headlights cutting through the snowfall. The parking lot filled slowly, methodically, each bike finding its position with the kind of precision that spoke of men who'd learned in other contexts that where you stood determined what you could protect. 91 motorcycles, 91 riders, all of them wearing the same expression. The expression of men who had decided some time ago, and for their own private reasons, to stop pretending they were anything other than dangerous. They dismounted in near silence. Kickstands down engines killed the sudden absence of mechanical noise, replaced by the sound of boots on asphalt and the distant moan of wind through the parking structure. Then they settled into position, spreading across the lot with a quiet efficiency that no one had directed out loud. But everyone understood, covering angles and exits and the 100 small vulnerabilities that a building acquired when someone knew how to look for them. At the center of the formation, Grayson Mercer climbed off a battered Harley-Davidson that looked like it had survived things it shouldn't have and kept running anyway. He pulled off his helmet, ran a hand through silver-threaded hair, and walked toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man entering territory he'd already decided was his. Inside the hospital, the night supervisor, a man named Gerald, who had spent 12 years managing nothing more dangerous than intoxicated patients and occasional family disputes, came sprinting down the hallway toward Naomi with his radio in one hand and his blood pressure visibly elevated. "There are bikers everywhere," he said, not quite whispering. "Should I call?" "No," Naomi said. Gerald stared at her. "They're surrounding the building." "I know." She turned from the window. "Don't call anyone." She walked down to meet Graves at the elevator. He was too large for the hospital room. That was the first thing that was true and kept being true, the way his shoulders created a particular geometry against the doorframe when he entered, the way his boots announced each step on the linoleum in a register that the room's acoustic design had not anticipated. Everything about him said danger, said here is something that has survived things by becoming whatever the things required it to become. And then he knelt beside the hospital bed, and his voice came out quiet enough to fall between the beeps of the monitors without disturbing them. "Hey," he said. Lily Cross opened her eyes. She was small in the way that children who have been systematically diminished become small, not just in the physical sense, though. She was that too slight and angular in the hospital gown that hung off her like something borrowed from a larger life. Her eyes were what stopped Graves. Brown, wide-set, carrying an attention that belonged to children who had learned early that reading the room was a survival skill. She looked at him without surprise, without the fear that most children would have shown at finding a scarred stranger kneeling beside their bed at 4 in the morning. She looked at him the way children look at things after they've stopped expecting the world to behave differently than it does. "You're big," she said. "Yeah. Are you going to hurt me?" The question landed with a weight disproportionate to its length. "No," Graves said. "I came to make sure nobody does." Lily studied him with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Her gaze moved to his hands, both of them resting on his knees, the right one trembling in its steady, involuntary way. She tracked the burn scars that mapped his palms and fingers, the old discoloration that had long since ceased to look fresh, but never stopped looking like something survived. "You got burned too," she said. "Afghanistan, long time ago. Does it still hurt?" "Sometimes." She looked toward the window. Through the glass across the parking lot, 91 men stood in the frozen night. Some had built small fires in metal barrels they'd brought from the compound. Not bonfires, just enough flame to keep fingers functional and vision possible. The fires threw orange light across leather jackets and scarred faces, in the slow exhalation of breath turning to vapor in the cold. "Who are they?" Lily asked. "People like me," Graves said. "People who know what monsters sound like when they move around in the dark. That's why we came." "My stepfather's going to be mad." "Let him. He'll come back. He always does." Graves looked at this 8-year-old child who talked about inevitable violence, the way other children talked about weather, not with shock or outrage, just with the flat acknowledgement of someone who had accepted the terms of their environment. Something moved in his chest. Something he had kept sealed off since Helmand Province, since the divorce, since the first letter that came back unopened. "Yeah," he said. "He probably will." "Are you scared?" The question surprised him, not because it was wrong to ask, but because it was exactly right. And children who asked exactly right questions in exactly right moments were the kind of danger he hadn't known to protect himself against. "Yeah," he said, "I'm scared." That answer seemed to mean something to her. She nodded slowly, as though he'd passed some test she hadn't announced she was administering. Then she reached out and touched the back of his right hand. Her fingers were cold, hospital cold, the particular chill of rooms kept at controlled temperatures without consideration for what bodies actually needed. She touched the burn scars, lightly tracing the topography of old damage with the matter-of-fact curiosity of someone comparing notes. "Don't leave," she said. "I won't." Her eyes drifted closed. Her hand stayed on his light as a question. Graves settled into the chair beside the bed and didn't move. In the doorway, Naomi stood watching. She'd known Graves Mercer peripherally for years, the way small-town proximity created a knowledge that was thorough without being intimate. She knew his reputation, the scarred veteran who lived out in the scrubland. With a compound full of men, the town had quietly agreed to leave alone. The bar fights from the early years, the restraining order, the careful distance that Rust Creek maintained between itself and the community that had assembled itself around his name. She had not, in any of that knowing, seen him be gentle with anything. She watched him sit beside a sleeping child in the gray hours of a January morning, motionless and patient, and understood that the world was more complicated than reputations. Dawn arrived the way Montana dawns arrived in January. Not as a revelation, but as a grudging acknowledgement that darkness couldn't hold indefinitely. The storm thinned slightly without stopping. Gray light filtered through clouds that had been present so long they seemed structural, load-bearing part of the landscape rather than weather passing through it. The bikers worked in shifts without anyone directing them. A rotation had established itself organically sometime in the early hours. 6 riders drifting to their bikes, warming engines, disappearing toward town, to return with coffee and thermoses and food in paper bags. 6 others stepping into the positions they'd vacated. The mathematics of sustained presence learned in places where sustained presence meant the difference between something holding and something breaking. Graves hadn't left Lily's room. He'd watched her sleep through the remainder of the night, with the attention of someone who understood that the absence of crisis wasn't the same as safety, that the most dangerous window was often the one between the threat you could see and the threat still organizing itself out of view. Every time she stirred, he leaned forward slightly and said something quiet. Just his voice, just presence. The oldest form of reassurance requiring nothing except the willingness to stay. When the day shift began arriving at 7, the hospital transformed. Nurses clustered in hallways and spoke in urgent tones. Two doctors came up separately to demand explanations that Graves didn't provide. Security guards hovered near elevators with their hands near radios and their faces expressing the discomfort of men asked to enforce rules against people who did not appear to be governed by them. Patricia Crane, the hospital administrator, arrived at 7:30 in clothing that communicated expense and authority in equal measure. She walked into Lily's room like a woman accustomed to the world reorganizing itself around her momentum. "You need to leave," she said to Graves. "This is a medical facility." "No," he said. Patricia Crane was not accustomed to that word from people she addressed in that tone. Her face underwent a brief internal negotiation. "I'll call the police." "Call them. This child is under state custody. You have no legal standing to be here." Graves looked up at her with eyes that had spent years in places where legal standing was an abstraction that other people invoked while you were busy making sure people got out alive. "That little girl," he said, "has burns on her body from the man who's supposed to be protecting her. He posted bail 6 hours ago. His brother is a deputy who is going to make sure the evidence disappears before anyone in CPS develops the courage to act. So here's what's happening. I'm staying in this room until someone with actual authority and actual responsibility for this child's safety shows up and demonstrates that she has some." He held Patricia Crane's gaze without apparent effort. "If that creates problems for you, you're welcome to explain to the news crews across the street why you removed the only protection standing between an 8-year-old and the man who burned her." Patricia Crane left without another word. The hallway outside the room quieted in her wake, the way spaces quieted after demonstrations of force that everyone present had agreed to collectively process later. Naomi appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later with coffee and an expression somewhere between exhaustion and something she couldn't quite name. "You just threatened the hospital administrator," she said. "I stated a sequence of events. She's ended careers for less." Graves accepted the coffee. "I don't have a career to end." Naomi leaned against the door frame and looked at the bikers outside, visible through the window, in their patient formation, smoke rising from their fires against the pale morning sky. She'd been awake for almost 30 hours. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was beginning to metabolize into something heavier and less useful. "Who are they?" she asked. "Really, I know they ride with you. I know some of them are veterans. But what makes 91 men drop everything at 3 in the morning and stand in a snowstorm for a child they've never met?" Graves was quiet for several seconds. He looked at the men outside. His right hand had settled into its low-grade tremor, the kind that had become background noise. "Most of them have kids they can't see anymore," he said finally. "Custody battles they lost. Families that came apart after they came home from wars that didn't fix anything they'd gone in hoping to fix. Some of them have daughters who don't return calls. Sons who grew up believing their fathers were the danger in the room." He paused. "They know what it's like to be the monster in a child's story. They've been carrying that for years." He looked at Lily, still sleeping, her small face finally slack with something that might have been rest. "This is their chance to be something different," he continued. "Even for one night, even for one kid. They came because maybe if they can keep this child safe, it means they're not completely past saving themselves. When I sent that message, I didn't ask anyone to come. I just said a little girl needed help. Every one of those men made their own choice." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "What about you?" she said quietly. "What's your reason?" He didn't answer immediately. Through the window, the fires flickered. The men stood their ground. "I've got a daughter," he said finally. "Clara, she turns 13 today. I wrote her a birthday letter last night that I won't send because her mother will intercept it, and because even if it got through, I'm not sure what I'd say that would make any difference." He set the coffee down. "I've been writing letters to Clara for 4 years. Letters about who I'm trying to be. Letters about the compound and the men here and the work we've been doing. Letters she probably hasn't read." "What happened?" Naomi asked. "I came home from the war rewired in ways I didn't fully understand, and I spent 3 years trying to manage it with whiskey and controlled rage, and by the time I figured out those were the wrong tools, I'd already become the thing the judge described in the restraining order." His right hand pressed flat against his thigh. Maybe the judge was right. Maybe I was dangerous. I don't know. What I know is that Clara grew up without a father because I couldn't figure out how to stop being a soldier before the people I love stopped being able to wait. You could try to reach her, outside of letters. I do try. Her mother blocks every channel. He paused. She says I'm not stable enough. Says my existing in Clara's life will hurt her. Is she right? Graves looked at Lily's sleeping face for a long moment, at the burns documented in photographs that sat in a nurse's bag, at the evidence of what the wrong man in a child's life could do. That's the question I can't answer honestly yet, he said, which is why I'm here. Not because I know I'm good for Clara, but because I know that being here doing this standing between one child and what's coming for her, that's the work that might eventually make me someone who deserves to find out. The room held that. Outside, one of the men below had started quietly singing something old and indistinct, a road song, the kind that didn't have a destination built in. Another voice joined, then another. Lily stirred, her eyes open. She looked toward the window and listened to the rough, off-key harmonizing rising from 91 men standing vigil in the cold. Are they singing, she asked. Yeah, Graves said. For me, for you, for themselves, for all the kids they couldn't get back to. He looked at her. Get some more sleep. Will you still be here when I wake up? Yes. She looked at him, 8 years old with eyes that had stopped trusting easily and not yet learned to stop wanting to. Promise, she said. It wasn't a question. Promise, Graves said. She closed her eyes. Outside, the singing continued. Rough voices, imperfect harmonies, the accumulated weight of men who had survived by becoming hard, discovering that hardness had a cost they hadn't anticipated, and were still each of them in their own slow way paying. The snow kept falling, the fires kept burning, and somewhere in the parking lot of St. Mercy Hospital in Rust Creek, Montana, 91 broken men stood watch in the dark because one of their own had asked, and because none of them could think of a better reason to be anywhere else. Dale Pruitt arrived at 11:47 in the morning. The diesel engine of his truck announced him before the vehicle was visible that particular overcompensating rumble of a man who had learned early that size was the most legible form of authority. He parked in the fire lane directly in front of the main entrance with the casual precision of someone for whom rules had always been suggestions directed at other people. The Confederate flag bumper sticker and the gun rack were both legible from 30 feet. Colt Pruitt rode passenger, still in uniform, badge catching the flat winter light. They climbed out and stood for a moment taking in the 91 bikers spread across the parking lot. The bikers stood and watched them back. No movement, no sound, no overt threat, just the specific quality of attention that made certain men understand on an animal level that they had arrived somewhere the math didn't favor them. Dale Pruitt was not a man who paid attention to math. He started walking toward the entrance. The swagger in his movement was the swagger of a man who had confused cruelty with confidence for so long that the two had become indistinguishable. Mid-30s tattoos up both forearms, a jaw set at permanent challenge. Beside him, Colt walked with his hand resting near his service weapon, and his uniform doing the work his expression wasn't sophisticated enough to do. Graves was waiting in the lobby. He'd left Lily with Naomi 20 minutes earlier, had positioned himself near the elevator bank with his weight settled and his arms at his sides, occupying space in the way that communicated intent without providing the legal vocabulary of threat. He'd been here before, not in this lobby, but in versions of this moment, the moment before the thing that was coming arrived, when the air still carried the possibility of it going differently before the choices narrowed. The automatic doors opened. Dale walked in first. He looked at Graves and didn't stop walking. Where is she? Dale said. Not here for you, Graves said. Dale stopped 6 feet away. Up close, the flat quality of his eyes was more legible, the affect of men who had learned early that empathy was a vulnerability to be exploited in others rather than practiced themselves. I've got legal custody. The court gives me the right to see my daughter. She's not your daughter. I've got paperwork says different. Your paperwork stops mattering the second you used her as an ashtray. Color moved into Dale's face. Behind him, Colt stepped forward. You need to step aside. We're authorized to be here. No, Graves said. Colt's hand tightened on his weapon. His badge caught the fluorescent light the way it was designed to. That's obstruction. Then arrest me. Don't tempt me. I'm not tempting you. Graves held Colt's gaze with the complete absence of performance. I'm daring you. Draw that weapon. See what happens next. They all knew what happened next. Through the lobby windows, 91 men stood watching. The moment Colt's weapon cleared its holster, the footage being captured on a dozen phone cameras in the hands of nurses and patients and visitors would tell a story that no amount of departmental spin would be able to reshape a deputy drawing his weapon on an unarmed veteran in the lobby of a hospital, while the man he'd bailed out of jail the night before stood 3 feet away. Colt was corrupt. He was not stupid. His hand moved away from the weapon. Dale had no such calculation operating. He stepped forward until he was close enough that Graves could smell the whiskey on his breath in the middle of the day. You think you're something? Dale said. His voice had dropped to the register men used when they wanted to threaten without witnesses being certain of it. You and your biker trash. That girl belongs to me. I raised her. I fed her. I kept a roof over her head. You burned her, Graves said. That's a lie. I saw the documentation. You saw nothing. Dozens of burns, systematic, some of them years old. You've been doing this since before her mother died. He held Dale's gaze. What happened to Ellen Cross Dale? Something moved through Dale's face too quickly to name. Car accident. Straight road. No skid marks. Accidents happen. 2 days before she was going to testify, Graves said. The lobby had gone completely quiet. Nurses behind their station had stopped pretending to work. Security guards had stopped reaching for radios. That's a lot of coincidence to carry around. Dale's composure cracked at the edges. The rage underneath was close to the surface now, the kind that had long since bypassed reason and operated purely on dominance reflex. You don't know anything about my family. I know what kind of man hurts a child to feel powerful. I know what kind of coward hits people who can't hit back. And I know that the only reason you've gotten away with it this long is that your brother wears a badge, and this town decided looking away was cheaper than looking at it. Dale's fist came up. Graves caught it before it connected. His left hand closed around Dale's knuckles with the mechanical precision of someone who had been hit before and had learned over years of iterative experience exactly where to intercept. He held it, not crushing, just held it. Just enough pressure to make bones communicate with nerve endings in a language that translated directly to understanding. Dale's eyes went wide. Something in them shifted the first genuine fear Graves had seen there. The fear of a man who has spent his life choosing targets that couldn't effectively fight back, suddenly standing in front of a target that could. Go home, Graves said quietly. Colt found his voice. That's assault. I'm a witness. Then arrest me, Graves said again. He released Dale's hand and stepped back. Put me in handcuffs. Process me. And while you're doing that, ask yourself whether you want your career defined by the morning you chose your brother over an 8-year-old with cigarette burns. Because that story exists now. It's on video. It follows you regardless of what happens next. Colt's face had gone the color of old concrete. He looked at the phone cameras, at the watching faces, at the calculation he'd walked into without seeing it coming. This isn't finished, he said. Yeah, Graves said. It is. Dale cradled his hand. The fury and humiliation moving through him were visible like weather. His mouth opened. He had threats ready. Graves could see them assembled waiting. Then something in Graves's expression made them seem inadequate, and Dale Pruitt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, found himself with nothing to say that the situation could support. He turned, walked toward the doors. Colt followed, pausing once to look back with the expression of a man filing something away for later. The automatic doors closed. The lobby released a collective breath. Graves stood alone in the center of it, listening to his heart hammer against ribs that had absorbed too many things to still register surprise. His right hand trembled violently now, the adrenaline making the nerve damage louder than usual. He pressed it against his leg and waited. Naomi appeared at the elevator 20 seconds later. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Probably both." "What happens when they come back?" Graves looked through the windows at his brothers. At 91 men standing in the cold under a gray Montana sky, steady as fence posts present as stone. Men who had lost things that mattered and kept standing anyway because the alternative was lying down, and lying down was something none of them had been built to do. "Then we'll be here," he said. Night came down over Rust Creek like a verdict. The storm that had threatened all day finally committed itself around 6 in the evening, dropping temperature and visibility, simultaneously turning the parking lot of St. Mercy Hospital into something that looked like the end of a long campaign. Small fires burning in metal barrels. Leather-jacketed figures standing in loose formations around the light breath rising in steady columns of vapor. The bikers had been there for 16 hours. They showed no signs of reconsidering. Inside the hospital, Lily Cross ate dinner from a tray that someone had brought without being asked. Hospital chicken instant mashed potatoes, a cup of fruit cocktail and syrup. She ate without enthusiasm, but with the focused attention of a child who had learned not to assume another meal was guaranteed. Graves sat in the chair beside her bed and watched her eat, and didn't comment on it because she didn't need commentary. She needed to be allowed to do an ordinary thing in an ordinary way without someone making it into evidence of something. "The man from this morning," Lily said, not looking up from her tray. "Dale, what about him?" "He'll tell people I'm lying." "Yeah, he will." "Will they believe him?" Graves considered the honest answer. "Some of them. People who want to believe him will find reasons. People who don't want complications will find reasons. That's what systems do. They find reasons to not look at difficult things." Lily moved her fork through the mashed potatoes in a slow circle. "My teacher believed me once. She called someone. Nothing happened." "I know. The time before that, my mom's friend called. Nothing happened then either." She looked up at him with those two old eyes. "Why is this different?" It was the right question. Graves had been asking himself a version of it since 2 in the morning, since Naomi's text, since he'd sent 11 words to 91 men, and they'd come without hesitation. Why was this different from all the other times the system had processed a child's suffering into paperwork and filed it somewhere dark? "Because this time," he said carefully, "the people standing between you and what's coming have already lost everything they were afraid of losing. That changes what they're willing to do." Lily thought about that. "Are you afraid of losing something?" He looked at her. "Yeah." "What?" "The chance to be someone worth trusting." She studied him for a moment with that focused inventory gaze. Then she went back to her fruit cocktail, and the question settled into the room and stayed there, which was its own kind of answer. Agent Desmond Howell arrived Sunday morning with a younger partner named Briggs, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades inside institutions that moved slowly and had stopped apologizing for it. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, a wedding ring worn smooth from years of contact. His face had the quality of someone who had looked at too many crime scenes to be shocked by anything, but hadn't yet become indifferent to them. Graves met him in the second-floor conference room. Naomi insisted on being present. She stood near the door with her arms crossed and the expression of someone prepared to testify. "Let me be direct," Howell said, settling into a chair across from Graves with the ease of a man who understood that authority didn't require performance. "You're not under investigation. This is what we call a courtesy conversation." "Courtesy for who?" Graves said. "For everyone involved in a situation that's attracting more attention than any of us finds useful." Howell opened a folder without looking at it. When 91 men surround a hospital and it becomes the lead story on 3 regional news affiliates, certain mechanisms activate. Federal mechanisms. The kind that don't discriminate between the well-intentioned and the problematic. His partner Briggs leaned forward. He was younger still, carrying the edge of someone who believed the work meant something. Your compound, 23 acres, minimal oversight, reports of military-grade equipment, surveillance infrastructure, weapons that are individually legal but collectively suggest preparation for something beyond personal protection. Add 91 motivated individuals who can mobilize in under an hour, and you stop looking like a veterans community and start looking like a private army. We're protecting a child, Graves said. Right now, yes, Howell said. But what about the next crisis? And the one after that? At what point does a private army with good intentions become a private army? At the point where we stop having good intentions. And you're the judge of that. Someone has to be. Howell was quiet for a moment, a pause that had thinking in it rather than discomfort. Colt filed assault charges against you. Dale Pruitt filed assault charges. The hospital administrator filed a formal complaint. That's 3 separate incidents in under 24 hours. He spread 3 photographs across the table. Surveillance images angles Graves hadn't noticed being captured. Every confrontation documented from positions that made them look worse than they'd been. Perception matters in federal investigations. Right now, the perception is that you're a vigilante organization with combat training and no institutional accountability. The institutional accountability failed the child, Graves said. Maybe, but here's what I need you to understand. Howell folded his hands on the table. My office has the authority to open an investigation into your compound that would make life very difficult for a significant number of your people. Tax returns, background checks, outstanding warrants, parole violations. Some of your men won't survive that scrutiny. You know that. I know that. He paused. I'm not threatening you. I'm describing the shape of the situation so you can make an informed decision. Graves looked at the photographs, at the images of men who had followed him into this because they'd chosen to, because they believed it mattered. Men with criminal records and custody violations, and the accumulated legal fragility of people who had spent years navigating a system not designed to accommodate them. What do you want? He said. I want you to stand down, send your people home, let CPS handle the placement, let the court handle custody, show good faith and give the system a chance to work. The system put Dale back on the street 6 hours after he was arrested. That's how bail works. That's how corruption works. Graves said it without heat, just as a factual correction. Dale Pruitt has been abusing that child for years. His brother has been making the evidence disappear for years. The judge who set the bail terms has been operating inside the same network for years. This isn't a system that failed accidentally. It's a system that was modified deliberately. Howell didn't respond immediately. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not surprise, but the acknowledgement of a thing he'd already suspected being confirmed by someone with direct information. If you have evidence of that, Howell said carefully, there are proper channels. Proper channels are what Lily's teacher used, and her mother's friend, and every other person who saw what was happening and believed the proper channels would handle it. Silence held the room. Through the window, the parking lot was visible, the Brotherhood patient as geography. 72 hours, Howell said finally. That's what I can give you before the institutional machinery starts turning regardless of my preferences. After that, I can't hold it. He gathered his photographs, stood. For what it's worth, he said at the door, I've been doing this work for 26 years. I know what a private army looks like. And I know what a group of damaged men trying to do the right thing looks like. He looked at Graves steadily. They're not always different things. That's the problem. Then he left. Naomi waited until his footsteps had faded down the hallway. 72 hours. I heard him. That's not enough time. No, Graves agreed. It isn't. He drove to Colt Pruitt's house at 2 in the morning. He drove alone. He'd told Prophet where he was going and told him not to follow. And Prophet had looked at him with the expression of a man who understood that telling him not to follow wasn't the same as being able to stop him, but who also understood that some things needed to happen with one person carrying the full weight. Colt's property sat on 3 acres outside town, a two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and mature trees providing privacy from the road. The kind of place that required either two comfortable incomes or one income being quietly supplemented by arrangements that couldn't survive scrutiny. The cruiser was in the driveway. One light burned upstairs. Graves sat in his truck across the road and watched the light for 20 minutes. The back door was alarmed. The garage was alarmed. The basement window had a lock that predated the current administration by roughly 40 years. Graves removed the screen with the patient efficiency of someone who had cleared structures in conditions that made a Montana basement seem straightforward, worked the latch with a thin piece of steel, and lowered himself into darkness. The basement smelled like gun oil and old cardboard, and the mustiness of spaces used for storage by men who kept things because discarding them felt like admitting something. Weight bench ammunition organized by caliber, a gun safe that was locked and not what he was looking for. In the corner, a four-drawer filing cabinet, unlocked. Graves turned on his flashlight and opened the top drawer. The files were organized by date going back 11 years. He pulled one at random and found what he expected. Arrest reports, traffic stops, incident documentation. Standard law enforcement record keeping. But stapled to each official report was a second document, handwritten recording cash amounts alongside dates and names. A ledger of supplemental income dressed up as personal notes. Colt Pruitt had been running a protection arrangement for years. Local businesses paying to have violations overlooked. A drug distribution operation 2 counties over paying for advance notice on enforcement activity. Defense attorneys paying for evidence that became unavailable at inconvenient moments. Graves photographed everything. Page after page, the flash of his phone's camera casting brief white light across a decade of systematic corruption. Then he found the third drawer. It was organized differently from the others. Where the upper drawers were dense with documents, this one held a smaller number of folders arranged with more deliberate care. He lifted the first one and found Lily's name on the tab. Inside, 4 years of medical reports, teacher statements, neighbor calls, anonymous tips. Every piece of documentation that should have triggered an investigation, should have opened a case file, should have initiated the chain of intervention that the system theoretically existed to perform. All of it collected here. All of it pulled from the official record and placed in this folder in Colt Pruitt's basement, where it couldn't go anywhere or do anything. He'd been intercepting it all. Every time someone saw something and did the right thing and made the call, Colt had received it, handled it, made it disappear. 4 years of other people's courage rendered meaningless by one man with access and motive, and a brother he'd decided was worth protecting at any cost. Graves photographed every page. Then he reached the last folder in the drawer. The tab read, Ellen Cross Vehicle Incident. He opened it. The official accident report was there, the one that had been filed and closed and filed away into institutional forgetting. Single vehicle, State Route 7, January 14th, no other parties involved. But behind the official report was something else. A second document, not official, not formatted for any department's filing system. A set of handwritten notes in Colt's recognizable script. Dates, times, a name Graves didn't recognize with the notation confirmed available, and a dollar figure beside it. A vehicle service date 3 days before the accident. The name of a mechanic with a star beside it, and the notation handled. And at the bottom in the same handwriting, EC testimony scheduled 16th. Incident 14th. Clean. Graves read it twice. Ellen Cross hadn't died in an accident. She'd been killed 2 days before she was scheduled to testify. The brake line failure, the straight road, the absence of skid marks, none of it had been coincidence or mechanical failure or the ordinary randomness of tragedy. It had been planned, paid for, and documented in a deputy's handwritten notes that should never have existed because no one who did what these notes described should have been arrogant enough to write it down. But Colt Pruitt had been operating inside a closed system for so long that the possibility of exposure had stopped feeling real. That was what impunity did to people. It made them sloppy. It made them believe the walls were higher than they were. Graves photographed every word. He was replacing the folder when he heard footsteps on the floor above him. He went still. The footsteps were deliberate and awake, not the random movement of someone half-conscious heading to a bathroom, but the measured tread of someone who had heard something and was responding to it. He heard the basement door at the top of the stairs, saw light flood down. "Someone down here," Colt's voice said. A statement, not a question. Graves pressed himself against the wall beside the filing cabinet and said nothing. He heard Colt descend slowly, weapon drawn based on the cadence of his movement, the careful, controlled steps of someone who had cleared rooms before and understood that corners were dangerous. Colt reached the bottom step. He swept the flashlight across the basement in a professional arc, and it found Graves standing flat against the wall with both hands visible and empty. The gun came up. "Mercer!" The word came out like something Colt had been expecting to say eventually. Not surprised, resolved. "Deputy," Graves said. "Breaking and entering. Theft of private property." Colt's weapon stayed level. "I've got every reason to shoot you right now." "And footage on my phone that gets transmitted to 3 separate locations the moment I stop moving," Graves said. "Which means shooting me tells a story nobody can stop." Colt's eyes moved to the filing cabinet, to the open drawer, to the phone visible in Graves's jacket pocket. "What did you take?" he said. "Everything." Graves held the deputy's gaze. 4 years of medical reports on Lily Cross that you pulled from official channels. The neighbor calls the teacher statements, the anonymous tips. The documentation of every cash payment you received for the services you provided to the people you were supposed to be arresting. He paused. And the notes on Ellen Cross. Something happened in Colt Pruitt's face that Graves recognized. It was the expression of a man watching a wall he'd spent years building come down in a moment and understanding that the time for negotiating its preservation had passed. "Those notes are inadmissible," Colt said. "Illegally obtained. In court, probably. In a federal investigation, they're the thread that gets pulled. And federal investigations don't stop when they find the first thread." Graves kept his hands visible. "Your brother didn't just beat a child, Colt. He had that child's mother killed. You helped him cover it up. That's not a family matter that disappears into county paperwork. That's a federal conspiracy charge with a mandatory minimum that a judge who isn't on Dale's payroll will have to honor." The gun was still up. Colt's hand was steady, but his breathing wasn't. "You have no idea what you've walked into," Colt said. "Tell me." A long moment. The basement breathed around them, cold and close. "Dale's connected," Colt said finally. "Has been for years. County commissioners, Judge Holt, 3 lawyers in town who handle arrangements that never see a courtroom. Ellen was going to testify about a land fraud operation that had been running for 9 years. If she'd testified, it wouldn't just have been Dale. It would have been the entire network." He paused. She didn't understand what she was part of. She just wanted out. She'd been talking to a federal investigator for 3 months. And Dale found out. Dale always finds out. That's why he's still operating. Colt's voice had flattened into something that might have been in another context resignation. "And that's why coming after him the way you're coming after him is going to get you and everyone you brought with you buried so deep it takes years to find the bodies." Or, Graves said, the network comes apart because someone pulled the right thread at the right moment. And everyone who built their safety on Dale Pruitt's continued freedom suddenly has to make different calculations about who they're willing to protect. Colt lowered the weapon slightly. Not all the way, just enough to communicate that the immediate decision had been made, and the immediate decision was not to shoot. "I could arrest you right now," he said. "You could. And everything you photographed becomes evidence in my investigation of your breaking and entering. While the copies transmit to 3 locations where people are already awake and waiting for them." Graves watched the deputy's face. "We both know how this plays out if you arrest me, Colt. You become the man who arrested the person who exposed what you did. That story exists already. It just needs an ending." Another long silence. "Get out of my house," Colt said. Graves moved toward the window he'd entered through. "The custody hearing is Wednesday," he said. "I've sent what I have to the FBI. They'll need time to build a proper case. But Lily doesn't have time. So whatever you're going to do with the information that your arrangement is over, do it fast. Because if that hearing happens with Judge Holt presiding, Lily goes back to Dale. And after that, it's not just corruption anymore. Colt said nothing. Graves climbed out through the window into the Montana cold and walked back to his truck. He used his left hand to open the door. His right was doing what it did after confrontations that mattered, shaking hard enough to be useless. The nerve damage reading the situation and announcing its opinion loudly. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. The night was absolute and cold around him. Somewhere in a house across town, an 8-year-old girl was sleeping in a stranger's home, and a deputy was standing in his basement, understanding that the closed system he had operated inside for years had just developed its first real crack. He started the engine and drove back to the compound. He called Howell at 5:30 in the morning. The agent answered on the second ring with the alertness of someone who had been awake or who slept lightly enough that the transition didn't require time. "I have evidence of systematic corruption involving Deputy Colt Pruitt," Graves said. "Child abuse cover-up over 4 years. Destruction of official documentation. A private arrangement servicing drug distribution and commercial fraud. And documented evidence of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Ellen Cross, Lily Cross's mother, who was killed 2 days before she was scheduled to provide federal testimony." Silence on the line. "Where did you get this?" Howell said carefully. "I can't tell you that. Then I can't use it." "Not directly," Graves said. "But if it pointed you toward the same evidence through channels that were legal, you could use that." A longer silence. "You're describing parallel construction." "I'm describing saving a child's life." The sound of Howell breathing, the sound of a man running calculations that involved his career and his conscience in the specific geometry of what was right pressing against what was procedurally defensible. "Send me what you have," Howell said. "Encrypted. I'll look at it tonight. If it's what you say it is, I can have investigators working legitimate channels by morning. The custody hearing is Wednesday." "I heard you the first time." "Howell." Graves paused. "Ellen Cross was already talking to a federal investigator when she died. That means there's a file somewhere inside your agency with her name on it. A file that was opened and then went quiet when she stopped being available to testify. Find that file." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll call you tomorrow," Howell said. Janet Whitmore came to the compound on Monday evening. She drove a county-issued sedan and parked 50 yards from the gate and walked the rest of the way with her hands visible, the way people approached uncertain situations when they wanted to communicate that they were not a threat. She was in her mid-30s, professional clothes rumpled from a long day face, carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been performing a difficult job while aware that the job was failing at its fundamental purpose. Prophet met her at the gate. Graves came down from the main RV when Prophet radioed up. "I shouldn't be here," Janet said. Her hands were not entirely steady. "If anyone finds out I came—" "Then don't tell them," Graves said. "What happened?" She looked at him for a moment, assembling something. "Then Lily was placed with the Kellerman family this afternoon. Good people, clean record. 2 previous successful placements. They've been doing this for 8 years. She paused. 3 hours after placement, Colt Pruitt showed up, unannounced. He identified himself as law enforcement conducting a routine welfare check and walked into the house before the Kellermans could do anything about it. He took Lily into a room alone for 12 minutes. Something cold and absolute settled into Graves's chest. "The Kellermans tried to stay present," Janet continued. "He threatened them with obstruction if they didn't give him privacy. When he came out, Lily was—" She stopped, started again. She was sitting in the corner of the room with her knees pulled to her chest, and she wouldn't speak. Wouldn't eat. Mrs. Kellerman heard fragments through the door. Something about keeping quiet, about what happened to girls who told stories, about families that took care of each other. The compound had gone quiet around them. The men who were within earshot had stopped what they were doing and were listening with the complete stillness of people receiving information that mattered. He was reminding her, Graves said. He was reminding her that nowhere is safe. That regardless of where she sleeps, he can reach her. That the badge means he goes where he wants and does what he chooses, and the people who are supposed to protect her can't stop him. Janet's voice had developed an edge that wasn't anger exactly, but was the thing that lived underneath anger when it had been compressed into professionalism for too long. CPS can't intervene. What he did was technically within his authority. Everything he did has a procedural name. So what are you asking? Graves said. Janet reached into her jacket and produced a business card. She held it out. 3 years ago, I had a case. A boy named Daniel, 6 years old, same situation as Lily. I followed procedure. I documented, I reported, I submitted, I waited for the system to work. Daniel was returned to his father's custody 11 days later. Her jaw was tight. Blunt force trauma. Ruled accidental. The desert night settled around them, cold and absolute. I can't officially help you, Janet said. I can't direct you, facilitate you, or know about anything you do. But if you find something real evidence, the kind that doesn't have provenance problems, and you need it to reach the right people inside the system, call that number. She pushed the card toward Graves. Anytime, day or night, I'll make sure it gets where it needs to go. Graves took the card. Why, he said. Because I've been carrying Daniel for 3 years, she said, and I'm tired of the wait. She turned and walked back to her car and drove away without looking back. Graves called the Brotherhood together at the compound that night. 87 men in a circle around fires that had been burning since they'd returned from the hospital. He stood at the center and told them everything. The files, Howell's timeline, what Janet had said about Colt visiting Lily, the arithmetic of where they were. The FBI needs time to build a parallel case, he said. They're working. But Wednesday morning is the custody hearing, and if Judge Holt is still on the bench when that hearing happens, Lily goes back to Dale. And after she goes back, whatever protection we tried to build doesn't matter anymore. He looked around the circle, leather and firelight, scarred faces and steady eyes. Howell has given us 72 hours before the federal investigation into this compound becomes active. That clock is almost up. He paused. I'm going to be honest with you about where that leaves us. Anyone who stays after tonight is staying with full knowledge that the legal exposure is real. Jobs, parole, custody arrangements, financial accounts. If the FBI starts digging, they find things. For some of you, what they find ends things. Nobody moved. He looked at Prophet. Prophet had been leaning against his bike with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had already made his decision and was waiting for the conversation to catch up with it. I've got a daughter I haven't spoken to in 8 years, Prophet said. My ex-wife made sure of that. Said I came back from the desert too broken to be around a child. He looked at the fire. Maybe she was right. But I've been asking myself for 8 years whether I'm the kind of man who shows up or the kind who disappears. And I'd like to be the other kind. Even once. Even for a kid I barely know. He looked at Graves. I'm here. Decker spoke next. Then a man named Sullins, who had barely said 20 words in the 3 days they'd been at the hospital. Then others. One at a time, going around the circle in a movement that wasn't orchestrated and didn't need to be. Men who recognized in Lily's situation the specific shape of their own failures, the child waiting at home for a father who came back wrong, choosing in the specific limited context of this one child situation to be someone different. 4 men were quiet. Graves looked at them. Anyone who leaves now, there's no judgment, he said. Walk away clean. This is the line. The 4 men looked at each other. Then they walked, quietly without drama. Graves watched them go and felt the weight of what the remaining 87 had chosen settle onto his shoulders, like something he'd been carrying all along and had only just acknowledged. We're going to try to do this within the law for as long as the law gives us room, Graves said to the circle. Howell is working. If the FBI moves fast enough, it resolves before Wednesday. If it doesn't, he paused. If it doesn't, I'm going to make sure Lily is somewhere safe, whatever that requires. That's kidnapping, Decker said. Not a challenge, just taxonomy. Yeah, Graves said. It is. Federal charges. Yeah. Another silence. The fires popped and settled. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the compound perimeter, a coyote moved through the scrub, its passing marked only by the brief disruption of quiet. Then let's make sure it doesn't come to that, Prophet said. What do we need? Howell called Tuesday morning. Ellen Cross's federal file exists, he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who had been awake most of the night and had found what they were looking for, and wasn't sure yet whether that was good news or just more weight to carry. It was opened 18 months before her death. The investigating agent was named Calloway. He retired 6 months after Ellen died. The file was marked inactive pending further development and placed in storage. Calloway, Graves said. We're looking at him, Howell said. And the financial records you sent us, the parallel work my team has been doing, trace the payments through 3 shell companies to a property management firm that Dale Pruitt is listed as a silent partner in. We can connect Dale Colt, Judge Holt, and 2 county commissioners through transactions that occurred within 72 hours of specific pieces of evidence disappearing from official files. How long until warrants? A pause. This is moving faster than anything I've been part of in this office. My supervisor is aware the U.S. Attorney Farwell out of Billings has been briefed. 24 hours, maybe less. The hearing is tomorrow morning. I know, Howell said. I know, Mercer. We're moving. Howell. Graves stood at the compound's edge and looked out at the scrubland, turning gold in the early light. Colt went to the foster home, spent 12 minutes alone with Lily, a silence that lasted several seconds. I'm sorry, Howell said, and the way he said it contained the knowledge of what that meant and the inability to undo it. I'm sorry that happened. Move faster, Graves said. He ended the call. He stood there for a moment in the early morning cold. He pressed his back against the compound fence and stood there until his breathing steadied, until the compound came back into focus around him. The RVs, the mechanic, shed the fire barrel still smoking from the night before. He thought about an 8-year-old girl sitting in the corner of a room in a house full of strangers pulling her knees to her chest because the man who had spent years destroying her safety had just demonstrated again that safety was something he could reach through walls. He thought about a birthday letter that was going to come back unopened. He thought about Clara, 13 years old, in a city he wasn't allowed to approach, growing up in the absence of a father who was trying from a distance to be someone worth knowing. He thought about the line between trying and doing. Then he went inside and told Prophet to get some sleep while he could. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Wednesday arrived the way reckonings always did, not with ceremony, but with cold light in the ordinary mechanics of a world that didn't pause for the weight of what was about to happen inside it. Graves was awake before 4. He'd slept in the compound's main garage in the chair beside the workbench, where Clara's unfinished letter still sat under the yellow light, because lying down in his bunk had felt like a kind of surrender he wasn't ready to make. His right hand was shaking before he opened his eyes. The nerve damage had been reading the situation all night and responding to it the way it always responded to things that mattered, by making his body announce its own unreliability at the worst possible moment. He made coffee with his left hand, stood at the garage door and looked out at the compound in the pre-dawn dark. The fires had burned low overnight. A few men were awake, moving quietly between the RVs and the mechanic shed, the careful movement of people who understood that the day ahead required everything they had and were conserving accordingly. Prophet appeared beside him at 4:30 with 2 cups replacing the one Graves had already finished. Howell called Prophet said, "It wasn't a question." Not yet. Prophet absorbed that. He was a man who had learned over years of hard experience that silence was its own complete communication. He stood beside Graves and drank his coffee and looked at the dark scrubland stretching out beyond the compound fence, and neither of them said anything about what the absence of Howell's call meant for the timeline. At 5:15, Graves's phone lit up. Not Howell, Janet Whitmore. He answered. "The hearing's been moved up," she said. Her voice was tight and controlled in the way of someone delivering information they'd been dreading. Judge Holt's clerk called 20 minutes ago. 9 a.m. instead of 10. No explanation given. It's Tuesday, Graves said. It's Wednesday. You've been awake too long. She paused. Graves, the clerk, also said Holt received correspondence late last night. I don't know what it contained, but his assistant told my colleague that he came in this morning looking like a man who had already made his decision. Graves set down his coffee cup. Where's Lily? He said. Still at the Kellermans. CPS Transport picks her up at 8:30. He checked his watch. 3 hours and 15 minutes. I'll be there, he said. He ended the call and looked at Prophet. Get everyone up, Graves said. The bail situation had been resolved overnight. After the confrontations of the previous days, the assault charges Colt had filed, and the breaking and entering that Graves hadn't been arrested for yet, but that existed as a legal reality regardless of bail bondsmen from Billings had appeared at the compound at midnight with paperwork that Prophet had been expecting. The Brotherhood had spent the previous week quietly liquidating what could be liquidated. 3 motorcycles sold to a dealer in Missoula bank accounts, pooled a truck that Decker had been restoring, traded against the bond amount. 87 men contributing what they could contribute to a number that represented freedom on a technicality. It wasn't infinite protection, but it was enough to keep Graves functional and present until the morning that was now arriving, whether anyone was ready for it. He showered in the compound's main facility, put on the clothes Prophet had laid out, dark jeans, a thermal, his leather vest, because he was not going to walk into a courthouse pretending to be something other than what he was. The vest had no club patches. It had never had club patches. It just had years of weather worked into the leather and the weight of something that had been present for everything that had happened since Afghanistan. He checked his phone one more time before starting his bike. Howell had not called. The Kellerman house was a single-story ranch on a residential street 3 miles from the courthouse. Blue shutters, a covered porch, a bird bath that was currently a solid cylinder of ice. The kind of house that communicated stability through its maintenance gutters. Clear walkway shoveled the considered presence of people who took care of things. Graves arrived at 7:45. Prophet, Decker, and Sullins parked a block away. The rest of the Brotherhood was staged at the courthouse, at the hospital, at the compound, dispersed by agreement into a distributed presence that couldn't be characterized as assembly, but covered the geometry of where things might happen. He rang the bell. Mrs. Kellerman answered. She was in her 50s, practical and clear-eyed, the kind of woman who had built her competence over years of doing difficult things without being recognized for the difficulty. She looked at Graves on her porch and then past him at the street and then back at him. She's been waiting for you, Mrs. Kellerman said. That wasn't what he'd expected her to say. He followed her inside. Lily was at the kitchen table in the clothes she'd been wearing when CPS had brought her from the hospital. Someone had brushed her hair. She had a glass of orange juice in front of her that she wasn't drinking. When Graves came through the kitchen doorway, she looked up at him, and something moved through her expression. Not relief exactly, because relief implied a safety she hadn't arrived at yet, but the specific acknowledgement of a person who had been waiting to see if the thing they were waiting for would actually appear. You came, she said. I said I would. She looked at him for a moment. Colt was here. I know. He said you were going to prison. Said by the end of today you'd be locked up and he'd make sure nobody could find you for a long time. Her voice was flat, reciting the tone of a child reporting facts without the energy to accompany them with the emotion the facts warranted. He said I should get used to going home because that's where I was going and there was nothing anybody could do about it. Graves sat down across from her at the table. Look at me, he said. She did. Whatever happens today in that courthouse in front of that judge, I want you to tell the truth. Not what you think I want to hear. Not what you think will help. Just what's true. What happened, what Dale did, what it was like, what you're afraid of. Just the truth in your own words. He held her gaze. Can you do that? What if the truth doesn't matter? Lily said. It was the most devastating question he'd heard in years. and it came from an 8-year-old who had arrived at it through direct experience rather than cynicism. It matters, he said. Even when the system doesn't act on it, it matters. It's recorded. It exists. It becomes part of the permanent account of what happened to you, and that account doesn't go away just because a judge ignores it today. Lily was quiet for a moment. She looked at the orange juice. Then, are you scared? Yes. What are you scared of? He thought about Clara, about the letter on the workbench, about 4 years of trying to reach someone through walls built by his own failures, about the specific terror of caring about something you couldn't control. I'm scared that I'm not enough, he said, that everything we've done, all of us all these days, won't be enough to change what's already been decided. That the people who built this system built it to protect itself, and one scarred veteran and 87 broken men standing outside can't change the fundamental architecture. Lily absorbed that. My mom used to say that being scared meant you still cared about something, she said. She said the people you had to worry about were the ones who stopped being scared because they'd stopped caring. Graves looked at this child who had survived things designed to destroy her and was still somehow in possession of wisdom she'd received from a woman who hadn't survived the same machinery. Your mom was right, he said. She's dead, Lily said, not with bitterness, just with the flatness of a fact that had been integrated so thoroughly it no longer needed inflection. I know, and I think what happened to her wasn't an accident. I think Dale made sure she couldn't testify. And I think that eventually the people who are supposed to care about that are going to act on it. But eventually isn't today. Lily looked at him steadily. What is today? Today we go to that courthouse and we tell the truth and we see what a judge does with it. And if the judge sends me back, he had promised himself he wouldn't make promises he couldn't guarantee. He had been very clear with himself in the hours he'd spent on this question that the difference between him and the adults who had failed Lily before was that he would not offer comfort built on things he couldn't deliver. He looked at her and said what was true. Then I keep fighting, he said. There are appeals, there are federal interventions, there are reporters who are already interested in this story and who will become more interested when they understand the full shape of it. There are lawyers who take cases pro bono when the cases are egregious enough. He paused. I will not stop. That's the only absolute promise I can make. I will not stop. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. She picked up the orange juice and drank it. The Rust Creek Courthouse had been built in 1923 and had absorbed in the century since the gravity of a building that had witnessed too many people walking in with hope and leaving without it. The stone steps were worn smooth. The columns out front were designed to make individuals feel small by comparison and therefore more compliant. Graves arrived at 8:50 with Lily beside him and Naomi on her other side. Prophet and Decker were outside in their leather making the bailiff nervous without doing anything specific enough to justify his nervousness. The rest of the dispersed brotherhood was visible at the edges, men positioned along the street and in the parking structure and in the coffee shop across the road, with the patient deliberateness of a perimeter that didn't announce itself. The hallway inside the courthouse was crowded. News cameras, reporters, people who had followed the story through 3 days of coverage and come to watch the ending. Dale Pruitt sat on a bench near the courtroom entrance. Beside him, Colt in full uniform badge polished to an assertive shine. A lawyer named Richardson, whose name Graves had seen in connection with 3 separate news reports about Dale's business arrangements over the past 2 days, sat beside them with an expensive suit in the practiced composure that came from being paid well enough to be unbothered by what you were asked to defend. Dale saw Graves come in. He smiled. The quiet, contained smile of a man who believed he had already won and was enjoying the formality of confirmation. Graves kept walking. Inside the courtroom, the space was smaller than its gravity suggested it should be. Wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, the smell of old paper and institutional cleaning products. Judge Merritt Holt was already on the bench, mid-60s, white-haired, the face of a man who had spent decades developing the capacity to deliver verdicts without appearing to feel them. He looked at Lily with a detached assessment of someone reviewing a file rather than regarding a child. The hearing proceeded. Janet Whitmore testified first on behalf of CPS, methodical and specific, documenting Lily's injuries, the pattern of abuse, the medical evidence. Her voice stayed level through things that shouldn't have been levelable. Richardson cross-examined with the practiced grace of someone who had done this before, turning documentation into ambiguity pattern into coincidence, the specific language of certainty into the reasonable language of doubt. Colt testified in his uniform. He described a loving stepfather navigating the difficult aftermath of a mother's death, a troubled child acting out, self-inflicted injuries. He delivered the fabrication with the credibility that uniforms conferred, each false statement carrying the institutional weight of the badge above his breast pocket. Richardson called a character witness for Dale, a neighbor who described him as a good man in a hard situation. The neighbor's voice was the voice of someone who had been spoken to recently about what they would and wouldn't say. Then Lily was called. She walked to the witness stand in the too big clothes and the borrowed shoes, and sat very straight in the chair, the way children sat when they were trying to be older than they were. She looked at Judge Holt and waited. Lily Holt said, "I need you to answer some questions for me. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Do you feel safe with your stepfather, Dale Pruitt?" A silence that lasted long enough to change the temperature of the room. "No," Lily said. "Can you tell me why?" "He burned me with cigarettes." Her voice didn't waver. "When I talked back, when I cried too loud, when he said I looked at him wrong, he would take out his cigarette and he would—" She stopped briefly, started again. "He did it a lot. Some of them are still there. The ones on my ribs." Richardson rose. "Your Honor, the child has been in the exclusive company of Mr. Mercer and his associates for 3 days. Any testimony she offers should be considered in that context." "She's answering a direct question," Naomi said from the gallery. The bailiff moved toward Naomi. Holt raised a hand. "Miss Cross," Holt said, "did anyone tell you what to say today?" "Graves told me to tell the truth," Lily said. "He said not to say what I thought he wanted to hear, just what actually happened." "And is that what you're doing?" "Yes." Holt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he looked at his papers. "I've reviewed the documentation from CPS, the medical reports, and the testimony presented today." He paused in the way that judges pause when the next words were going to be important. "While the medical evidence raises concerns, I am also concerned about the environment to which this child has been exposed over the past several days. The presence of an organized group of individuals with criminal records, the violence that occurred in the hospital parking lot, the federal attention this situation has attracted." The courtroom door opened. Everyone turned. Agent Desmond Howell walked in. He was followed by 2 federal marshals and a woman in a dark suit who moved with the authority of someone carrying paper that changed rooms. Howell looked at Judge Holt with the expression of a man who had something to say and was going to say it regardless of what had been happening before he arrived. "Your Honor," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. I'm Agent Desmond Howell, FBI Field Office Billings. I need to inform this court that as of 47 minutes ago, federal arrest warrants were executed for Dale Pruitt, Colt Pruitt, and Merritt Holt." The room went absolutely still. Holt's face underwent a transformation that moved through several phases in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, and then something that might have been beneath the layers of accumulated authority, a kind of collapse. The woman in the suit stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Deanna Farwell. The warrants cover charges including conspiracy to obstruct justice, destruction of federal evidence, conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Ellen Cross, and in your case, Your Honor, accepting payment in exchange for judicial decisions in at least 11 cases over a period of 7 years." She looked at him steadily. "You are required to recuse yourself from these proceedings immediately. Federal marshals are present to take you into custody upon adjournment." A sound moved through the courtroom, lower than a gasp, more complex, the sound of a room full of people recalibrating what they thought was true. Dale Pruitt stood up from his bench behind the bar. His lawyer Richardson grabbed his arm. Dale shook him off. Colt was already reaching for something protocol or weapon or some vestige of the authority he'd spent years treating as absolute when the two marshals moved toward him with the efficient decisiveness of people who had done this before and found hesitation expensive. "Dale Pruitt," one of the marshals said, "you are under arrest." Dale looked at Graves across the courtroom. The smile was gone. In its place was something raw, the expression of a man who has built his entire identity on the certainty that consequences apply to other people, encountering the moment when that certainty stops being true. Not fear exactly, the disorientation of a fundamental premise failing. Then the marshals reached him and the expression disappeared behind procedure. Graves looked at Lily. She was still on the witness stand. She was watching Dale being handcuffed with an expression that was almost impossible to describe. The expression of someone who has been afraid of a thing for so long that the removal of the thing doesn't produce immediate relief, but rather a kind of stunned suspension. The gap between the end of danger and the beginning of understanding that the danger is actually over. Graves walked to the witness stand. He knelt beside the chair. "It's done," he said quietly. Lily looked at him. Her eyes were dry. "He's going to prison." "Yes." "What about Colt?" "Both of them." She was quiet for a moment, watching the marshals escort her stepfather through the side door of the courtroom, watching Colt follow in his polished uniform that was no longer a uniform, but just a costume, watching Judge Holt rise from his bench with the diminished posture of a man whose institution had just been pulled out from under him. Then Lily Cross looked at Grayson Mercer and said, "Can we go home now?" He had to stop for a moment before he could answer. "Yeah," he said, "we can go home." The custody hearing reconvened 6 weeks later with a judge named Elaine Burrow presiding. She had been appointed by the federal court specifically for cases emerging from the corruption investigation, which had by that point expanded to encompass 9 separate defendants and a financial network that had been operating since before Lily was born. The courtroom was smaller than the county courthouse. The atmosphere was different, less performance, more consideration. Burrow was in her early 60s, practical in her manner, with the quality of attention that distinguished judges who believed the work mattered from those who had stopped. Janet Whitmore testified on behalf of CPS. She had spent the 6 weeks between the arrest and the hearing preparing the most thorough placement recommendation of her career. She stood in the witness box and made the case with the composed precision of someone who had been carrying Daniel's name for 3 years and had decided that Lily's case was where that weight got redirected into something that changed an outcome. When Richardson, still representing procedural interests, suggested that Graves's criminal history made him an unsuitable guardian, Janet responded without hesitation. "Mr. Mercer has attended every court date, every supervised visit, every therapeutic session that has been scheduled in the past 6 weeks. He has been present consistently and without exception. In my professional assessment, that record of presence is more predictive of parenting capacity than the absence of a criminal record in someone who has never been tested." Graves testified last. He stood in the witness box without the management of impression that courtrooms usually produced in people, the careful posture, the selected language, the performance of being more composed than you were. He stood the way he stood everywhere, large and scarred and right-handed, in a way that announced its own damage. Judge Burrow looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, adopting a traumatized child is not a redemption project. It is not a second chance to correct a previous failure. It is a daily commitment to someone who will require patience and stability and professional support that you may not be equipped to provide on your own." She paused. "Are you prepared for that reality?" "No," Graves said. Burrow waited. "I'm not prepared," he continued. "I don't know how to do this. I failed the first time I tried to be a father, and I carry that failure every day. I may fail again. I'm not standing here to tell you I'm someone I'm not." His right hand was trembling. He didn't press it against his leg. He just let it be what it was, visible, present, the permanent announcement of something survived. "What I can tell you is that I will be there every day. When I don't know what I'm doing, I'll find someone who does. When Lily needs professional support, she'll have it. When she needs space, I'll give her space. When she needs someone to sit beside her in the dark, I'll sit there." He paused. "And when I can't do it alone, I have 87 people who have already demonstrated that they'll carry weight that isn't technically theirs to carry. Because that's what we built out there. Not a biker gang, not a militia. A group of men who failed their own families and spent years trying to figure out how to be something better. Lily knows what broken looks like. So do we. That's not a disqualification. That might be the most relevant qualification we have." Burrow was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Lily. "You've heard what I asked him. What do you want to say?" Lily had been sitting beside Janet throughout the hearing, wearing a blue dress that someone had bought her and shoes that fit. She had listened to every word of every testimony with the focused attention of a child who understood that what was being said would determine the shape of the rest of her life. She looked at Judge Burrow. "Graves doesn't try to fix me," she said. "He just sits with the broken parts. Most adults, when they see something broken in a kid, they want to fix it, or they want to pretend it's not there. He does neither. He's there. And that makes the broken parts feel less like something wrong with me and more like just something that happened." Burrow looked at her for a moment with the expression of a judge who had presided over enough of these hearings to know the difference between coach testimony and a child telling the truth in their own unpolished way. She picked up her pen. "By the authority of this court," Burrow said, "the petition for adoption is granted. Lily Cross is henceforth Lily Mercer with all the rights, protections, and legal standing that designation carries." She looked at Graves over the paperwork. "Don't make me regret this." "I won't," Graves said. And then, because he'd learned in the past 6 weeks that precision mattered, "I'll try my absolute hardest not to." The gavel came down. Naomi was crying in the back row. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in the courtroom and had been failing at that promise for the past 20 minutes. Prophet was beside her, not crying, but doing the thing he did when he was managing something that wanted to be expressed. Very still breathing with deliberate control. His jaw set in the way of a man containing something large. Lily looked at Graves. She stood up from her chair and crossed the courtroom floor and put her arms around him, and he held her with his left arm fully and his right arm doing its trembling best, and said nothing because nothing was what the moment needed. After a while, she pulled back and looked up at him. "Dad," she said. It was the first time. He didn't have words. He didn't try to find them. He just nodded, and she seemed to understand that the nod contained everything the words would have. And she took his hand, the right one, the trembling one, the one that announced its damage to everyone who saw it, and held it. Spring came to Rusk Creek the way Montana Springs came. Not gradually, but all at once, a collective decision made overnight that winter had gone on long enough. One morning the ground was frozen and the sky was gray, and the scrubland lay dormant under cold it had accepted as permanent. The next morning, something had shifted. Wildflowers appeared in the rocky soil around the compound, with the cheerful indifference of things that had been waiting under the surface all along, requiring only the right conditions to become visible. Someone had hung a tire swing from the old juniper at the compound's eastern edge. Graves hadn't asked who. It had simply appeared one morning, hung with the solid competence of a man who had decided the compound needed a tire swing and had acted on the decision without requiring acknowledgement. Lily's room was in the largest of the converted RVs. Graves had spent 2 months on it. New floor, fresh paint, the color she'd picked from a hardware store chip selection, with the focused deliberation of someone making a permanent decision. A shelf for the books that had been arriving in small stacks since Naomi had spread the word. Half the shelf was novels. The other half was motorcycle maintenance manuals that Prophet had quietly supplied and that Lily read with the concentrated attention she applied to things that interested her. On the first real warm evening of March, Graves sat on the compound's main step with a coffee that was going cold and watched Lily chase 2 of the other Brotherhood children around the perimeter fence in a game that appeared to have no fixed rules beyond the requirement of running. She was fast, faster than the other kids expected, which she had figured out, and was exploiting with a tactical awareness that Prophet had already noted approvingly, and Graves recognized from somewhere he didn't examine too closely. Prophet sat down beside him. "She's doing okay," Prophet said. "Yeah, therapy helping. Dr. Malone says she's one of the more resilient kids she's worked with. Says the resilience is real, not performed." Graves watched Lily cut left around the fence post and gain 3 steps on the boy chasing her. "She still has nights. Wakes up and comes and knocks on my door. We sit in the kitchen for a while. She doesn't always want to talk. Sometimes she just wants the light on and someone present." "What do you do?" "Make cocoa. Sit there. Wait until she's ready to go back." Prophet was quiet for a moment. "That's what it is," he said. "That's the whole job. People think it's the big moments. It's not. It's the sitting in kitchens at 2 in the morning doing nothing in particular." Graves thought about Clara, about the birthday letters, about 4 years of trying to reach someone through walls built by his own failures. "I got something last week," he said. Prophet looked at him. "From Clara." Prophet straightened slightly. "She wrote back," Graves said. "Not to one of my letters. She wrote directly on her own to the compound address. Her mother doesn't know." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He didn't unfold it. He'd read it enough times that the words were part of him now. "She said she's been reading my letters. Has been for 2 years. Her mother couldn't intercept all of them. Said she wasn't ready to respond before. Said she's still angry and still confused and still doesn't know what she wants." He paused. "But she wanted me to know she doesn't hate me, and that she's been thinking about what it might be like to meet, on her terms, when she's ready." Prophet was quiet for a long time. "Lily wrote to her," Graves said, "on her own without telling me she was going to. Sat down at the table one evening and wrote 3 pages and addressed it herself. I saw the envelope in the outgoing mail and asked her about it. She said," he stopped. "She said someone should tell Clara the truth about you, and I know what the truth is because I've been watching." Prophet looked at the sky. Montana sky in March blue turning toward the specific depth of late afternoon, the kind of color that existed nowhere else, with quite that quality of being complete. "How long before Clara's 18, he said. 4 years and 7 months. You going to wait?" "She asked me to wait," Graves said. "And she knows about Lily now. She knows she has a sister who is 9 years old and learning to rebuild motorcycle carburetors, and who decided on her own to write a letter on behalf of a father she's known for 6 months. He folded the paper carefully and put it back in his pocket. "I'll wait, however long it takes." Lily's 9th birthday fell on a Saturday. The compound had been preparing for 3 days, which was apparent in the accumulated evidence. A folding table large enough to hold the quantity of food that 87 men considered appropriate for a child's birthday. More balloons than could be structurally justified, and a cake that Decker had ordered from a bakery in Billings and transported in a process he described only as complicated, and that had arrived intact. The afternoon was warm enough for shirt sleeves. Fires burned in the barrels not for warmth, but because fires were how the Brotherhood marked occasions, regardless of temperature. Someone had strung lights between the RVs that came on as the sun went down and turned the compound into something that looked from the right angle like a small, improbable celebration of the fact of being alive. Naomi came. Janet Whitmore came in civilian clothes, looking like a different person outside the context of professional obligation. Dr. Malone, Lily's therapist, sent a card that Lily read twice and then put on her shelf between a novel and a manual on 2-stroke engines. The singing happened at sunset. It was the same rough harmonizing that had happened in St. Mercy's parking lot 5 months earlier. The same off-key convergence of voices that hadn't been used for singing in years and showed it the same quality of men rediscovering something they'd thought they'd lost access to. Lily stood in the middle of it with frosting on her chin and looked around at 87 scarred faces singing in the firelight and laughed a real laugh, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that came from a place that hadn't been burned out. Graves stood at the edge of the circle and watched it. He thought about the January night in the parking lot When he had watched these same men stand watch in the snow for a child they didn't know, and how he hadn't fully understood yet what they were all doing, that they weren't just protecting Lily, they were practicing being the people they'd wanted to be all along and hadn't known how to become. That Lily had given them the occasion for it, that she had given him the occasion for it. Lily found him at the edge of the circle. She had cake on her elbow as well as her chin, and she didn't appear to care, which was one of the things about her that had not required work or encouragement, her fundamental indifference to the opinions of people who weren't important to her. "This is the best birthday I've ever had," she said. "Yeah." Uncle Prophet cried a little when I blew out the candles. "He'll deny it." "I know." She looked up at Graves. "Do you think Clara would like it here?" He looked at her. "I think she might." "When she comes—" Lily paused, self-correcting with the care of someone who had learned to distinguish between what she wanted and what was promised. "If she comes. I want to show her the carburetors and the tire swing. And I want her to meet Prophet, even though he'll try to be intimidating because he does that with new people." "He does. But he's not actually intimidating once you know him." "No," Graves agreed. "He's not." Lily looked at the compound, at the lights strung between the RVs, at the fires and the men, and the tire swing visible at the perimeter catching the last of the evening light. "This is real right," she said. "This is actually ours." It was a question she asked occasionally in different forms at different moments, not from a place of doubt, but from a place of needing to confirm something she was still in the process of learning she was allowed to have. Dr. Malone had explained it to Graves in the calm language of someone who had spent years translating the aftermath of damage into terms that people without clinical training could act on, that children who had experienced sustained loss of safety needed to repeatedly check the reality of safety before they could begin to trust its permanence, that the checking was not weakness, that the checking was the work. "It's real," Graves said. "It's ours." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to the party. He was awake at 2 in the morning. Not from a nightmare, though. Those still came less frequently now, and with less of the total immersion quality that had made sleeping in his own company feel dangerous in the years after he came home. Just awake in the way he'd always been awake in the hours between midnight and dawn, his body's alarm system not entirely convinced that sleeping through the night was safe. He went to the garage. The workbench was the same. The yellow light, the cold coffee smell, the quality of silence that a space accumulated when it had been used for solitary thinking long enough that the thinking became part of the atmosphere. Clara's letter was on the workbench. He'd moved it from the spot where the unfinished birthday letter had sat, the one he'd been writing on the night Naomi called the one that had never been finished, the one that was now replaced by something real. He read it again, though he knew it by heart, because reading it was still a thing that required doing a fact that needed to be confirmed, the way facts confirm themselves through repetition. She didn't hate him. She was thinking about meeting. She had read the letters. He set it down and looked at the workbench and thought about what to write back. He'd been drafting responses in his head for a week, assembling and discarding, trying to find the language that was honest, without being overwhelming, that acknowledged the distance without apologizing for it in ways that put the weight on her. He found a blank piece of paper. He picked up the pen. His right hand trembled. He switched to his left the way he always did, the way he'd learned to do every important thing. Leading with the hand that was steady, accepting the help of his own left side, without shame working around the damage instead of pretending it wasn't there. He wrote, "Dear Clara, I don't have the right words for what I want to say, so I'm going to say the true words instead and hope they're close enough. I know I failed you. I know there's no explanation for that that makes it smaller than it is. I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm just going to tell you that Lily asked me last week if you'd like the tire swing. She's been saving the good side of it for you, the side that gets the best evening light. She said you can have it whenever you want it. I'll be here. Take all the time you need." He folded the letter. Through the garage door, the compound lay quiet under a sky so full of stars it looked structural, as though the darkness needed all that light to hold itself together. The fires had burned down to coals that still threw small warmth into the cold air. The RVs and storage containers sat in their imperfect arrangement, the homes of men who had arrived at this place because they'd run out of other options and stayed because they'd found something here that other places hadn't offered. Something that looked like family if you were willing to expand your definition. From somewhere in the compound, from the direction of the largest RV, from the room with the blue walls and the half shelf of novels and the half shelf of maintenance manuals, came a small light in a window, star-shaped. The kind of nightlight a child picked out because it turned darkness into something navigable, because it was proof that light existed even in the middle of the worst nights, because it was a choice a person could make, regardless of what was happening around them. Graves looked at it for a long moment. His right hand was shaking. It would always shake. The damage was permanent, and the permanence had stopped bothering him in the way it once had, because permanence was just another word for the thing that was true, regardless of whether you wanted it to be, and you could spend your life fighting what was true, or you could learn to build around it to find out what was still possible inside the limitations, to discover that the limitations were not the whole story. He was not the man he'd wanted to be. He was not healed, not fixed, not the uncomplicated version of a father that existed in the stories people told themselves about how families were supposed to work. His hands shook. He woke at 2 in the morning and sat in garages writing letters to daughters he was still learning how to know. He carried the dead weight of the third man in the Humvee, and probably always would. He had broken things that weren't fully repaired and might never be. But in the room with the star-shaped nightlight, a 9-year-old girl was sleeping without fear. And in a city 400 miles away, a 13-year-old was reading old letters and thinking about tire swings. And outside, 87 men who had arrived here running from what they'd become were sleeping in the places they'd made for themselves, and in the morning they would wake up and do it again. Show up, stay present, carry weight. That wasn't technically theirs, practice being the thing they'd always wanted to be, and had mostly failed at and kept trying anyway, because the alternative was lying down, and none of them had been built for that. Graves put the letter in his jacket pocket. He looked at the star-shaped light in Lily's window for one more moment. Then he went back inside and lay down and closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, sleep came without the sound of things he couldn't change.